The dust from the stagecoach had barely settled when Margaret Sullivan stood on the main street of Willow Creek, her shoulders squared despite the weight of the world pressing down on her. The year was 1873, and the promise of a new life in the West had crumbled to nothing when her husband succumbed to tuberculosis 2 months into their journey. Now she was alone with 4 hungry children, a handful of coins, and a letter from a cousin who'd passed on before Margaret could reach her. "Mama, I'm hungry," whispered 6-year-old Sarah, tugging at Margaret's travel-worn skirt. Margaret's other children, 10-year-old Thomas, 8-year-old Elizabeth, and 3-year-old Daniel, stood silently beside her, their faces dirty and tired from the long journey. "Soon, sweetheart," Margaret assured her, though she had no idea how she would keep that promise. The bank had foreclosed on their farm back in Ohio after Daniel was born, and with Charles gone, there was nothing left for them in the East. The town of Willow Creek, nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies, was their last hope. But looking at the dusty main street with its weathered buildings and unfamiliar faces, Margaret felt that hope slipping away like water through cupped hands. "Madam? You look like you could use some assistance." The deep voice startled her. Margaret turned to see a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and kind blue eyes. His weathered hat was tipped back, revealing sandy brown hair, and despite the trail dust on his clothes, there was something dignified in his bearing. "I'm fine, thank you," Margaret replied automatically, her pride still intact despite everything. She'd learned early in life that a woman alone was vulnerable, and a woman with children even more so. The man nodded respectfully. "The name's Jacob Miller. I run the Miller Ranch about 5 miles outside of town." He glanced at the children, his expression softening. "Town's not the most welcoming place when you first arrive, but folks here are good people once you get to know them." Margaret hesitated, then introduced herself. "Margaret Sullivan. These are my children Thomas, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Daniel." Jacob smiled at the children, then looked back at Margaret with something like understanding in his eyes. "You've come a long way, Mrs. Sullivan." "Yes," she admitted, "and I fear it was for nothing. My cousin Harriet wrote to me of opportunities here, but I've just learned she passed on last winter." Jacob removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "Harriet Green? I knew her. Good woman. She spoke of family back east." He glanced at the meager belongings piled near the stagecoach. "If you don't mind my asking, what were your plans?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Harriet mentioned work in her letter. I can cook, clean, sew. I had hoped to find employment, and perhaps a small place to rent." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Sullivan, I don't mean to presume, but my ranch is short-handed, particularly in the house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera, could use help, especially with the cooking for the ranch hands. There's a small cabin on the property that's sitting empty." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's not charity I'm offering, but honest work." Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or impropriety. All she saw was sincere concern. "This is where hope lives, Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly. "Not always in the way we expect, but it's here all the same." Something in his words resonated deep within her. After months of grief and uncertainty, the simple offer of work and shelter was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "The children," she began, "would be welcome," Jacob assured her. "There's plenty of space for them to run and play. Thomas there looks old enough to learn ranch work if he's interested, and my housekeeper has a granddaughter about Elizabeth's age." Margaret hesitated only a moment longer. "We accept your offer, Mr. Miller." "Thank you." Jacob's smile was warm as he replaced his hat. "Let me help you with your things. My wagon's just down the street." As they loaded their belongings, Margaret felt both relief and trepidation. She had no choice but to trust this stranger, this cowboy with kind eyes who spoke of hope. What she didn't know was that Jacob Miller had his own reasons for offering help to a widow and her children, reasons rooted in a past he rarely spoke of. The journey to Miller Ranch was quiet, the children too exhausted to chatter. Margaret sat beside Jacob on the wagon seat, her back straight despite her fatigue. The land around them was unlike anything she'd known in Ohio, vast open spaces, rolling hills, and in the distance, the majestic outline of mountains against the sky. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Jacob nodded. "That it is. Takes some getting used to, all this space, but after a while, you can't imagine living any other way." As they crested a hill, the ranch came into view. A large main house built of timber and stone stood proudly against the backdrop of pine-covered slopes. Several outbuildings, a barn, and corrals dotted the property, and in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully. "Welcome to Miller Ranch," Jacob said, a hint of pride in his voice. Margaret felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, small but present, like the first green shoot after a long winter. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and a plump, gray-haired woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jacob Miller, you bring home the most interesting things," she called out, her accent revealing her Mexican heritage. Jacob chuckled. "Mrs. Rivera, this is Mrs. Sullivan and her children. They'll be staying in the west cabin, and Mrs. Sullivan will be helping you with the cooking and housework." Mrs. Rivera's warm brown eyes assessed Margaret and her children quickly. "About time you brought some help. These cowboys eat like they have two stomachs." She smiled at the children. "You must be hungry after your journey. Come inside, and we'll find something to fill your bellies." The children perked up at the mention of food, and even Margaret felt her spirits lift at the woman's warm welcome. "The cabin needs airing out," Jacob said. "But it should be comfortable enough once we get it cleaned up." "I'm sure it will be fine," Margaret assured him, though she had no idea what to expect. After a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and applesauce that had the children eating with more enthusiasm than they'd shown in weeks, Jacob led them to the cabin. It was indeed small, just 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, but it was solidly built, with a stone fireplace and 2 windows that let in the afternoon light. "It's not much," Jacob apologized. "It's more than we had yesterday," Margaret replied honestly. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." Jacob nodded. "Get some rest. Tomorrow comes early on a ranch, but don't worry about starting work right away. Take a day or 2 to settle in." After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of the single bed in the smaller room, watching her children explore their new home. Thomas had already claimed a corner of the main room for his bedroll, while the girls would share the bed with Margaret and little Daniel. "Mama, are we staying here now?" Elizabeth asked, her blue eyes serious. "For a while, yes," Margaret answered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I like it," Thomas declared, peering out the window at the ranch yard. "Mr. Miller has horses. Maybe he'll teach me to ride." "We'll see," Margaret said cautiously. She didn't want the children getting too attached to a place that might be temporary. But as she tucked them in that night, her own exhaustion finally catching up to her, she found herself grateful for Jacob Miller's kindness. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, she was disoriented, but then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the children, and stepped outside. The early morning light bathed the ranch in a golden glow. Ranch hands were already moving about the yard, heading toward the barn or the cookhouse. Margaret took a deep breath of the clean mountain air, feeling more alert than she had in months. "Good morning," called Jacob, approaching from the direction of the main house. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time," Margaret admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." Jacob shook his head. "No need for thanks. Ranch this size needs many hands." He gestured toward the cookhouse. "Mrs. Rivera is starting breakfast if you'd like to join her. The children can come over when they wake." Margaret nodded. "I should help. If you're sure you're up to it." "I've never been one to sit idle, Mr. Miller." A small smile tugged at Jacob's lips. "I'm beginning to see that, Mrs. Sullivan." In the cookhouse, Mrs. Rivera was already preparing a massive breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs. She welcomed Margaret with a wooden spoon and directions to stir a pot of oatmeal. "The men work hard. They need good food," Mrs. Rivera explained. "Jacob is a good boss, fair and honest. Not like some ranchers." "How long have you worked for him?" Margaret asked, grateful for the conversation. 5 years now. Since he bought this place from old man Garrett. My husband works with the horses. Our daughter married one of the hands, and they live in the east cabin with their little girl, Lucia. Margaret stirred the oatmeal, absorbing this information. "Mr. Miller isn't married?" Mrs. Rivera shook her head. "No, though not for lack of trying from some of the town ladies. He keeps to himself mostly. Has his reasons, I suppose." Before Margaret could ask more, the door opened, and her children tumbled in, followed by a little girl with dark braids who could only be Lucia. The children eyed each other shyly until Mrs. Rivera introduced them, and soon they were chattering away as children do, the barriers of newness quickly falling. The day passed in a blur of activity. Margaret helped Mrs. Rivera prepare meals for the ranch hands, scrub dishes, and learn the rhythms of the ranch house. Jacob was absent for most of the day, out with the men tending to cattle, but he returned for the evening meal, taking time to ask Thomas if he'd like to help with some of the simpler chores around the ranch. "Yes, sir!" Thomas exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "Good. We'll start tomorrow morning." 6 o'clock sharp, Jacob said with a wink at Margaret. That night, as Margaret tucked her children into bed, Sarah asked, "Mama, are the bad times over now?" Margaret stroked her daughter's cheek. "I hope so, sweetheart. I truly hope so." But life had taught Margaret Sullivan to be cautious with hope. She'd learned that lesson the hard way when Charles first fell ill, when the farm failed, when each new doctor shook his head and said there was nothing to be done. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford to indulge too freely. Yet as the days turned into weeks, Margaret found herself settling into life at Miller Ranch. The children thrived in the open air, their cheeks growing rosy with health. Thomas followed Jacob around like a shadow, soaking up knowledge about horses and cattle. Elizabeth and Sarah became fast friends with Lucia, and even little Daniel seemed happier, toddling after the chickens in the yard or napping in a patch of sunlight on the cabin floor. Margaret, too, found herself changing. The constant worry that had been her companion for so long began to ease. There was still grief for Charles, still moments when she missed him so fiercely it took her breath away. But those moments came less frequently as she filled her days with honest work and her evenings with her children's laughter. And then there was Jacob Miller. Margaret found herself watching him when he didn't notice the gentle way he spoke to the horses, how he always had time for the children's questions, the respect he showed to every person on his ranch regardless of their position. He was unlike any man she'd known, including Charles, who had been a good husband but had never quite understood Margaret's restless spirit. One evening in late June, about a month after their arrival, Margaret was hanging laundry behind the cabin when Jacob approached, leading his horse. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he called. "Mr. Miller," she acknowledged with a nod. "I was wondering if you and the children might like to join me for a picnic on Sunday. There's a spot by the creek that's particularly nice this time of year." Margaret paused, a damp shirt in her hands. "A picnic?" Jacob shifted, looking almost boyish in his uncertainty. "Yes, madam. Thought the children might enjoy a change of scenery, and you've been working hard. Seemed like a nice way to spend a day of rest." Margaret considered the invitation. It was innocent enough, and the children would certainly enjoy it. "That's very kind of you. We'd be delighted." Jacob's smile was warm. "I'll arrange everything. Don't worry about bringing anything but yourselves." As he walked away, leading his horse, Margaret found herself smiling. Perhaps it was time to allow a little hope back into her heart after all. Sunday dawned clear and warm. Jacob arrived at the cabin mid-morning with a wagon already loaded with blankets, a picnic basket, and fishing poles for the children. Thomas was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of fishing, while the girls chattered about looking for wildflowers. The creek was about a mile from the ranch house, a clear, rushing stream that wound through a small meadow dotted with wildflowers. Tall cottonwoods provided dappled shade, and the sound of the water over rocks created a soothing backdrop. "It's beautiful here," Margaret said as Jacob helped her down from the wagon. "One of my favorite spots on the ranch," he admitted. "I come here sometimes to think." They spread blankets in the shade while the children explored. Thomas and Jacob set up fishing lines, Elizabeth and Sarah gathered wildflowers, and Daniel was content to splash in the shallow edge of the creek under Margaret's watchful eye. The picnic Mrs. Rivera had prepared was delicious fried chicken, biscuits, fresh berries, and lemonade. They ate with appetites sharpened by the mountain air, and afterwards, the children continued their explorations while Margaret and Jacob sat in companionable silence. "May I ask you something, Mr. Miller?" Margaret said finally. "Jacob, please." "And yes, you may ask me anything." "Jacob, then." "And you must call me Margaret." She hesitated. "Why did you offer us a place here? You didn't know us. We could have been anyone." Jacob was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the children playing by the creek. "I recognized something in you that day in town." A certain kind of determination mixed with desperation. "I know what it's like to be at the end of your rope with nowhere to turn." Margaret studied his profile. "You do?" He nodded. "I wasn't always a rancher. I grew up in Philadelphia, the son of a banker. Was being groomed to follow in my father's footsteps when the war came." "The war between the states?" "Yes. I enlisted in '62, served until Appomattox. Came home to find my father had died, the bank had failed, and my fiancée had married another man." He said this without bitterness, just stating facts. "I had nothing left in Philadelphia, so I headed west with what little money I could scrape together." "And you ended up here?" Jacob smiled slightly. "Not right away. Tried my hand at prospecting, freight hauling, even worked as a deputy for a while in Denver. Nothing seemed to fit until I found this place. Old man Garrett was looking to sell, and I had just enough saved to make an offer." "You've done well with it," Margaret observed. "It's been a blessing," Jacob agreed. "But it can be lonely sometimes." He turned to look at her directly. "When I saw you and your children that day, something told me you belonged here." Margaret felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "I'm not sure we belong anywhere anymore. Not since Charles died. I think we all belong somewhere, Margaret. Sometimes it just takes us a while to find it." His words stayed with Margaret long after they returned to the ranch that evening, the children tired but happy from their day of adventure. She thought about them as she tucked the little ones into bed, as she helped Thomas clean the mud from his clothes, as she sat alone on the small porch of the cabin watching the stars come out one by one. Did they belong here, in this wild, beautiful place so different from the ordered fields of Ohio? Could she make a life here for herself and her children? And what of Jacob Miller, with his kind eyes and quiet strength? The attraction she felt toward him both thrilled and frightened her. It seemed disloyal to Charles somehow, though in her heart she knew her husband would have wanted her to find happiness again. July brought scorching heat and the roundup of cattle for market. The ranch hands worked from dawn until dusk, and Jacob was often away for days at a time, riding the range with his men. Margaret missed his presence more than she cared to admit, even to herself. When he returned, dusty and tired but satisfied with the work accomplished, he always made time to check on Margaret and the children. He brought small gifts: a book for Thomas, hair ribbons for the girls, a wooden toy for Daniel that one of the hands had carved. For Margaret, he brought conversations and companionship, sitting with her on the cabin porch after the children were asleep, talking of everything and nothing. "I've never known a woman like you, Margaret Sullivan," he told her one such evening as they watched heat lightning play across the distant mountains. "I'm just an ordinary woman trying to do right by my children," she demurred. Jacob shook his head. "There's nothing ordinary about you. Most women would have broken under the weight of what you've carried." Margaret considered this. Perhaps I simply didn't have the luxury of breaking. The children needed me to be strong. That's just it, you found strength when you needed it most. That's rare, Margaret. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. Jacob, whatever she might have said was interrupted by a cry from inside the cabin. Daniel was having a nightmare, something that happened occasionally since Charles's death. Margaret rose quickly. I should go to him. Jacob stood as well. Of course. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Jacob. As she soothed her youngest back to sleep, Margaret wondered what might have happened if Daniel hadn't woken. Would Jacob have kissed her? Would she have let him? The thought both excited and terrified her. August brought with it a heatwave that had everyone moving sluggishly and seeking shade whenever possible. It also brought trouble in the form of rustlers targeting the smaller ranches in the area. Jacob doubled the night watch on the herd and rode out frequently with the men to check the boundaries of his land. Be careful, Margaret told him one morning as he prepared to ride out. The children would be very disappointed if anything happened to you. She didn't add that she would be devastated. Jacob's expression softened. I'll be careful. Promise me you'll stay close to the ranch house while we're gone. Of course. We'll be fine. But fine was not how Margaret would describe the scene 3 days later when Jacob and his men returned. They rode in hard, one of the younger hands slumped over his saddle, blood staining his shirt. Margaret! Jacob called as they neared the house. We need help. Margaret ran from the cookhouse where she'd been helping Mrs. Rivera prepare dinner. What happened? Rustlers. They ambushed us near the North Ridge. Pete took a bullet. Jacob dismounted and helped ease the injured man from his horse. Where are the children? With Mrs. Rivera's daughter. What can I do? Doc Harrison is away in Denver. Do you know anything about treating gunshot wounds? Margaret swallowed hard. I helped nurse soldiers during the war. I know a little. That's more than the rest of us. Let's get him inside. They carried Pete to an empty room in the main house. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, leaving an ugly wound that was still bleeding sluggishly. I need hot water, clean cloth, whiskey if you have it, and a needle and thread, Margaret instructed, falling back on skills she'd hoped never to use again. While Jacob gathered the supplies, Margaret cut away Pete's shirt to better see the wound. The young man was pale and semi-conscious, moaning softly. You're going to be fine, Pete, she assured him, though she wasn't certain of that at all. Jacob returned with the supplies, and together they cleaned the wound. Pete screamed when Margaret poured whiskey over it, then passed out from the pain, which was a blessing as she began to stitch the ragged edges together. You've done this before, Jacob observed, holding the lamp steady for her. Too many times, Margaret replied grimly. During the war, I volunteered at a field hospital near our farm. I saw things no one should ever have to see. I didn't know. It's not something I like to remember. She tied off the last stitch and covered the wound with a clean bandage. He needs to be watched for fever. If infection sets in, I'll stay with him, Jacob promised. You should check on the children. Margaret nodded, suddenly exhausted. The familiar smell of blood and whiskey had brought back memories she'd tried hard to bury, young men crying out for their mothers, the sickly sweet smell of gangrene, the helplessness she'd felt as boys younger than Thomas breathed their last under her care. She found her children safely playing with Lucia under the watchful eye of Mrs. Rivera's daughter, Elena. They were blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in the main house, and Margaret was determined to keep it that way. Is the young man going to be all right? Elena asked quietly. I hope so, Margaret replied. The bullet went through clean, which is a blessing. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret returned to the main house to check on Pete. Jacob was still sitting by his bedside, looking grim. He's feverish, he told her as she felt the young man's forehead. I was afraid of that. Margaret dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it across Pete's brow. We need to keep him cool and get him to drink if he wakes. They took turns through the night, Margaret dozing in a chair when Jacob was watching, Jacob doing the same when she took over. By morning, Pete's fever had broken, and he was sleeping more naturally. "He's young and strong," Margaret told Jacob. "I think he'll recover." Jacob's relief was palpable. "Thanks to you. You saved his life, Margaret." "We both did," she corrected him. "Now you should get some rest. You look exhausted." Jacob smiled tiredly. "So do you." They parted at the door of the main house, the early morning sun just beginning to peek over the mountains. Margaret walked back to the cabin, her mind full of the night's events and the way Jacob had looked at her when he said she'd saved Pete's life with respect and something else, something that made her heart beat faster. The rustlers were captured a week later by the sheriff and his deputies, with help from Jacob and men from neighboring ranches. Peace returned to the valley, and Pete recovered enough to sit on the porch of the main house and receive visitors, proudly showing off his bandaged shoulder to anyone who would look. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of gold in the aspen trees on the mountainsides. It also brought a letter for Margaret, forwarded from the town where her cousin had lived. "It's from my brother-in-law," she told Jacob that evening as they sat on the cabin porch. The children were inside, Thomas reading to his siblings from a book Jacob had brought him from town. "Charles's brother?" Jacob asked. Margaret nodded. "Robert Sullivan. He and Charles weren't close, but after Charles died, Robert offered to take the children if I couldn't manage." Jacob's expression grew serious. "And now? He's heard from someone that I'm here. He writes that he and his wife are childless and would still welcome the children." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she refolded the letter. "He says they could provide advantages I never could: good schools, fine clothes, a respectable home. And what do you think of his offer?" Margaret stared out at the mountains, now shadowed in the fading light. "A month ago, I might have considered it. Now," she shook her head. "The children are happy here. They're thriving. Thomas talks of nothing but horses and cattle. Elizabeth and Sarah have their friendship with Lucia. And Daniel." She smiled softly. "Daniel calls your name in his sleep sometimes, did you know that?" Jacob's expression softened. "I didn't. You've become important to them. To all of us." Margaret took a deep breath. "I don't want to leave, Jacob. But I have to think of what's best for the children." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand in his. "What if I told you that you never have to leave? That this could be your home, permanently?" Margaret's heart began to race. "What are you saying, Jacob?" He turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. "I'm saying that I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I think I've loved you since that first day in town when you stood there with your children, looking so determined despite everything. I love your strength, your kindness, your fierce devotion to your children. I love the way you've made this place feel more like a home than it ever has before." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "Jacob, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it hasn't been that long since you lost Charles. I know you might not be ready. But I wanted you to know that there's a place for you here for all of you if you want it." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw everything she'd come to admire about him: his honesty, his quiet strength, his fundamental decency. "I do love you," she whispered. "I didn't expect to, didn't think I could ever love anyone after Charles, but somehow you made your way into my heart." Jacob's smile was radiant as he leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing passion as Margaret responded. It was different from Charles's kisses, not better or worse, just different, uniquely Jacob. When they finally pulled apart, both a little breathless, Jacob asked, "Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you and the children make Miller Ranch your permanent home?" Margaret's answer was another kiss, this one filled with all the hope and promise of their future together. They were married in October, when the aspen trees were at their golden peak. The ceremony was held on the ranch, with Mrs. Rivera, Elena and her husband, and all the ranch hands in attendance. Thomas stood proudly as Jacob's best man, and the girls scattered wildflower petals they had dried themselves. Margaret wore a simple dress of deep blue that Jacob had ordered from Denver, and her hair was adorned with a wreath of late-blooming asters that Elizabeth and Sarah had woven for her. "You are so beautiful," Jacob whispered as they said their vows before the circuit-riding preacher who had come especially for the occasion. "And you are the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making," Margaret replied. After the ceremony, there was a feast laid out on tables in the yard, music from fiddles played by two of the hands, and dancing that lasted well into the night. The children stayed up far past their bedtime, caught up in the joy of the celebration. Later, when they were finally alone in the main house, Jacob had insisted they take the master bedroom while Mrs. Rivera stayed with the children in the cabin for the night. Margaret found herself suddenly shy. "It's been a long time," she admitted as Jacob came to her, having given her time to prepare for bed. He took her hands in his. "We have all the time in the world, Margaret. Nothing needs to happen tonight if you're not ready." His consideration touched her deeply. "I am ready," she assured him. "Just a little nervous." Jacob's smile was tender as he drew her into his arms. "Then let me help you forget those nerves." His kiss was gentle but thorough, and Margaret felt herself responding with increasing passion. Charles had been a considerate lover, but there had always been a certain reserve between them. With Jacob, she felt free to express her desires, to surrender to the feelings he awakened in her. That night, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Margaret and Jacob began to build the physical aspect of their marriage on the foundation of respect and love they had already established. It was a joining of bodies that reflected the joining of their lives, and when Margaret cried out in pleasure, it was both a release and a beginning. Afterward, lying in Jacob's arms, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" he asked, stroking her hair. "For giving us a home. For loving the children as if they were your own. For loving me." Jacob tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for bringing life and laughter back to this place. For trusting me with your heart and your children." They fell asleep entwined, the first night of many they would spend together in the years to come. The adjustment to their new family arrangement wasn't without challenges. Thomas, in particular, struggled sometimes with accepting Jacob as a stepfather, feeling it somehow dishonored his father's memory. But Jacob was patient, never pushing, always respecting the boy's feelings while quietly demonstrating through his actions what it meant to be a man of integrity. "Your father will always be your father," Jacob told Thomas one day as they worked together repairing a fence. "Nothing can change that, and I wouldn't want it to. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be a father to you too, in my own way." Thomas had considered this seriously, then nodded. "I think Pa would have liked you," he said finally. "He always said a man should judge another by his actions, not his words." Jacob smiled. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Thomas agreed. "But I'm glad you're here now, since he can't be." It was a small breakthrough, but an important one. Similar moments happened with each of the children as they adjusted to their new family structure. Elizabeth took to calling Jacob Papa almost immediately, while Sarah was more hesitant but equally affectionate in her own way. Daniel, being the youngest, accepted the change most easily, and soon it was as if Jacob had always been part of their lives. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in November. The ranch settled into its cold weather routines, feeding cattle, chopping wood, mending equipment, and spending long evenings by the fire. Jacob read aloud to the family most nights, everything from the Bible to adventure stories to Shakespeare, which had been a passion of his since boyhood. Margaret found herself happier than she had ever expected to be again. There were still moments of sadness when she thought of Charles, still days when she wished he could see how the children were growing and thriving. But those moments no longer overwhelmed her. They were part of her story, but they didn't define it anymore. In January, Margaret discovered she was expecting a child. She told Jacob one snowy evening after the children were asleep, and his joy was boundless. "A baby," he said in wonder, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you pleased?" Margaret asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "More than I can say," Jacob replied, kissing her tenderly. "How are you feeling?" "Well enough. A little tired, a little queasy in the mornings, but nothing unusual." They decided to wait to tell the children until Margaret was further along, but they shared the news with Mrs. Rivera, who was delighted and immediately began knitting tiny garments. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. By April, Margaret's condition was obvious, and they gathered the children to share the news. "There's going to be a new baby in the family," Jacob announced at breakfast. "Your mother and I are expecting a little brother or sister for you sometime in August." The reactions were mixed. Elizabeth and Sarah were thrilled at the prospect of a baby to help care for. Daniel, now 4, was confused but excited because everyone else was. Thomas, nearly 12, was quiet at first. "Thomas?" Margaret prompted gently. "What do you think about having a new brother or sister?" Thomas looked at her, then at Jacob. "Will you love this baby more because it's really yours?" he asked Jacob directly. Jacob's expression softened. "Thomas, I couldn't love any child more than I love you and your sisters and brother. This baby will be your brother or sister in every way that matters, just as you are my son in every way that matters." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "All right then. I hope it's a boy. There are already too many girls around here." Elizabeth stuck her tongue out at him, and the moment of tension dissolved into laughter. Spring brought new life to the ranch calves in the pastures, wildflowers on the hillsides, and the promise of the baby growing within Margaret. Jacob was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest more and hiring additional help for the house to ease her workload. "I'm pregnant, not ill," Margaret protested when he tried to stop her from helping with the spring cleaning. "Humor me," Jacob replied with a smile. "It's my first time being a father from the beginning." Margaret relented, touched by his concern. And truthfully, she was more tired with this pregnancy than she had been with her others, perhaps because she was older now, or perhaps because ranch life was more physically demanding than her previous life had been. As summer approached, bringing with it the heat and the bustle of the busy season on the ranch, Jacob became increasingly protective. He hired a young woman from town, Mary Fletcher, to help with the children and the housework, ensuring Margaret could rest during the hottest part of the day. "You're spoiling me," Margaret told him as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. "You deserve to be spoiled," Jacob replied, his hand resting on her rounded belly. As if in response, the baby kicked vigorously, making them both laugh. "Strong, like his mother," Jacob said. "Or her father," Margaret countered. They had decided not to try to guess the baby's gender, happy to be surprised when the time came. July was scorching hot, and Margaret felt increasingly uncomfortable as her due date approached. Dr. Harrison, back from Denver and now making regular visits to check on her, assured them everything was progressing normally. "First babies often come late," he told Jacob, who was growing anxious as the due date neared. "And technically, this is Mrs. Miller's first baby with you, so it might follow the same pattern." But the baby had other ideas. On the last day of July, 2 weeks before she was expected to deliver, Margaret woke in the night with strong contractions. "Jacob," she whispered, shaking him awake. "It's time." Jacob was instantly alert. "Are you sure? It's early." "I'm sure." Margaret grimaced as another contraction gripped her. "This isn't my first baby, remember?" Jacob sprang into action, sending one of the hands to fetch Dr. Harrison from town while Mrs. Rivera and Mary took charge of the children, moving them to the cabin for the duration. The labor was faster than Margaret had expected, and more intense. By the time Dr. Harrison arrived, she was already in the final stages. "This baby is in a hurry," the doctor commented as he examined her. Jacob held her hand through each contraction, his face a mask of concern as she struggled. "You're doing wonderfully," he assured her. "So strong, so brave." Talk to me, Margaret gasped between pains. Distract me? So Jacob talked, telling her about his plans for the ranch, for their family, for the future they would build together. His voice anchored her through the worst of the pain, and when it was time to push, his encouragement gave her strength she didn't know she had. Their daughter was born just as the first light of dawn touched the mountains. She entered the world with a lusty cry that made Dr. Harrison chuckle. A healthy girl with a fine set of lungs, he announced, placing the squalling infant on Margaret's chest. Margaret looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers, and felt a wave of love so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She's beautiful, she whispered. Jacob, still holding her hand, leaned down to kiss Margaret's forehead, his own eyes wet with tears. She's perfect. Just like her mother. They named her Hope, in honor of the words Jacob had spoken to Margaret that first day in Willow Creek. Hope Miller came into a family already full of love, with 4 siblings eager to meet her and parents who saw in her tiny face all the promise of their future together. The children were allowed to visit later that day, once Margaret had rested. They crowded around the bed, their eyes wide with wonder at the tiny new addition to their family. She's so small, Sarah marveled, gently touching Hope's hand. You were all that small once, Margaret told them. Even you, Thomas. Thomas, trying to maintain his dignity as the eldest, nevertheless looked fascinated by his new sister. She has Pa's hair, he observed, using the term he'd finally begun to apply to Jacob. And your mother's chin, Jacob added, his arm around Thomas's shoulders. As Margaret watched her complete family gathered around the bed, she thought of how far they had come since that dusty day in Willow Creek. From 4 children and no hope to 5 children and a heart full of it. Thank you, she said softly to Jacob when the children had been ushered out to let her rest again. For what? He asked, sitting beside her on the bed, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. For seeing something in us that day. For saying those words that gave me the courage to take a chance on you, on this place. Jacob smiled, taking her hand in his. This is where hope lives, he repeated. And now we have the proof of it right here. Margaret looked down at their daughter, then back at the man who had become her partner, her love, her anchor in the wild beauty of the West. Yes, she agreed. This is exactly where hope lives. And as the years passed, as Hope grew from infant to toddler to child, as Thomas became a fine young man who eventually took over much of the running of the ranch, as the girls blossomed into beautiful young women with dreams of their own, as Daniel discovered a talent for working with horses that rivaled Jacob's, Margaret never forgot the truth of those words. Hope lived in the ranch house that expanded to accommodate their growing family. It lived in the land that sustained them through good years and bad. It lived in the community they built around them, in the friendships they formed, in the legacy they created together. Most of all, Hope lived in the love between Margaret and Jacob, a love that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a dusty street and had grown into something strong enough to weather any storm, tender enough to heal old wounds, and deep enough to last a lifetime. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house was filled with the comfortable sounds of family, Margaret would often find Jacob watching her with the same look of wonder he'd had the day Hope was born. "What are you thinking?" she would ask. And Jacob would smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in the Colorado Territory," he would reply. "Because you chose to stay. We both got lucky that day," Margaret would tell him. And it was true. In finding each other, they had both found something neither had dared to hope for: a second chance at love, a family made stronger by the challenges they had overcome, and a future bright with possibility. This was where hope lived. And it would continue to live there for generations to come.